You are listening to The Yangtze Incident, Britain's Last Battle in China. Research written and narrated by Mark Felton. Episode 1. On the open bridge of the sloop HMS Amethyst, Lieutenant Commander Bernard Skinner raised his binoculars and searched the banks of the wide Yangtze River, his Chinese river pilot calling out small course corrections to avoid the many sandbars and navigational hazards. Skinner's other officers also scanned the banks, all looking for the origin of the artillery shells that tore overhead with a whine or threw up great geysers of water close to the ship. The Amethyst was on her way to Nanking from Shanghai, wending her way along China's greatest river as her predecessors had been doing for over 100 years. It was April 1949, and China was in the grip of an horrific civil war. Britain's position in the Middle Kingdom was extremely unsteady. Skinner turned to his second-in-command. Number 1, action stations. The young lieutenant quickly relayed the command, the ship's electric warning bell ringing insistently as all hands ran to their assigned posts, the gunners dragging on white anti-flash hoods and gauntlets as they manned the turrets forward and aft. Number 1, get the Union Jacks unfurled, starboard first. The crew quickly unfurled huge British flags on both sides of the ship, clearly marking the vessel as neutral. Full ahead both, ordered Skinner down the voice pipe to the wheelhouse beneath the bridge, the coxswain repeating his order. The Amethyst picked up speed, but still the shells kept coming at them. Yeoman, break out battle ensign, ordered Skinner, and atop the radar tower the white ensign proudly snapped out into the wind. It's coming from the north bank, sir, said Number 1, as they all trained their binoculars onto the communist-held side of the river. I saw the flash that time. Skinner did not hesitate. Tell director, train on bearing green 70. The gunnery officer ordered the turrets to turn onto the north bank, and the guns were loaded. The gunnery officer could not yet see the enemy guns, and could only estimate their position and range whilst he looked for their smoke. Open fire, said Skinner. A moment later, the Amethyst's 4-inch guns started pumping shells into the riverbank as Chinese shells started to get the range and began to batter the British ship. Tell wireless office, make from Amethyst to all ships, am under heavy fire. Seconds later, a Chinese shell struck the bridge, killing or wounding everyone on it. Britain was fighting its last battle in China. The Western domination of China formally came to an end in 1943 when the governments of the Allied powers agreed to relinquish control over the many concessions and enclaves. With the exception of Hong Kong, a crown colony, all other British concessions were signed over to Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists. Any future trading with China would be conducted under Chinese laws, foreigners losing their rights to extraterritoriality. Of course, this was all rather a moot point, as the concessions were then all under Japanese occupation. It was only in September 1945, following the Japanese surrender, the British armed forces returned to a very changed China. Post-war China was in turmoil. The uneasy truce that had largely held between Chiang's nationalists and Mao Zedong's communists had completely broken down once the common Japanese enemy had been removed from the picture. A civil war based on a conflict between two political ideologies had swiftly broken out, a disaster not just for war-ravaged China, but also for the British, and other Western hopes of re-establishing lucrative trade now that the Japanese were gone. The situation was complicated because the nationalist capital, then recognized as the legitimate government of China, was located in Nanking, today called Nanjing, far up the Yangtze River from the coast, and British traders and diplomats were isolated and increasingly vulnerable as communist forces approached the city. In order to protect British interests in Nanking, the Royal Navy stationed a guard ship there, with orders to evacuate British and Commonwealth nationals if the communists threatened the city. The days of the China gunboat were over, these useful vessels having become casualties during the war or handed over to the nationalists as bribes to keep them on the Allied side. But the Yangtze is a huge river, easily navigable for large ships for 1,500 miles into the Chinese interior. In April 1949, the guard ship at Nanking was HMS Consort, a 1,885-ton C-class destroyer built in 1944. With a full complement of 186, including embarked Royal Marines, the Consort was due to be relieved by another ship coming up from Shanghai, HMS Amethyst. The Amethyst was a smaller vessel than the Consort, officially designated a modified Black Swan-class sloop of 1,350 tons, though with a larger crew numbering 192 men under Commander Bernard Skinner. A sloop was a large corvette designed primarily as a convoy escort and anti-aircraft vessel. Built in Scotland in 1942, the Amethyst had scored some successes as an anti-U-boat patrol vessel during the war. She was armed with 6 quick-firing Mark 16 4-inch anti-aircraft and dual-purpose guns, housed in 3 twin turrets, 2 fore and 1 aft. These guns fired 35-pound high-explosive shells, and the vessel was also armed with heavy machine guns. No one on board the Amethyst expected a fight. Her mission was routine, though the crew expected to see some fighting between nationalist and communist troops, for Mao's forces had reached the north bank of the Yangtze River and dug in, while more troops moved on Nanking. It was only a matter of time before the communists crossed the river and the Amethyst would be called upon to evacuate British and Commonwealth citizens from the Chinese capital. The British certainly underestimated the deeply ingrained hostility towards them harboured by communist troops, who looked upon the British and other foreigners as having abused, robbed and cheated China for over 100 years for their own profit and power. The communists did not want to see imperialist ships on the Yangtze. In Nanking, the Consort was tied up to pontoons secured to the riverbank adjacent to a dried egg powder factory. If or when civil disorder occurred, all British nationals were told to make for the dried egg powder factory, where Jolly Jack would defend them by turning the egg factory into a kind of fort, armed with Lanchesters, Bren guns, rifles and pistols, with Consort on its river flank with its heavier arms, recalled Petty Officer Terry Curry, who was serving on the Consort at the time. Every day, large junks passed Consort jam-packed with what I took to be refugees, said Curry. They all looked very poor and dirty in their padded quilted jackets. Ordinary British sailors understood little of the situation in China, perhaps cared even less. Civil war was raging in China at this time, recalled Curry, yet I cannot recall being unduly worried. It was their war, nothing to do with us. Such was the effect of my cocooned and controlled life aboard ship, I thought that Mao's army was a rabble of peasants armed with pitchforks and staves. On the 20th of April, HMS Amethyst was making her way up the Yangtze, when at 8:31 a.m. a burst of small arms fire from the north bank passed close to the ship. 10 shells in quick succession followed this from a People's Liberation Army, or PLA, artillery battery, the shells all dropping well short of the Amethyst, throwing up great plumes of muddy river water. Skinner was not alarmed. He assumed that the communists were firing at the nationalist bank of the river and had misjudged their fall of shot. Skinner ordered speed to be increased and 2 very large Union Jacks to be unfurled on both sides of the ship to make sure that those ashore knew their nationality and neutral status. The firing stopped immediately. At 9:30 a.m., the Amethyst was passing the town of Jiangyin, now Jiangyin, approximately 100 miles east of Nanking by river. The boom of artillery startled the crew as PLA batteries on Low Island opened fire. This time there was no doubt that the gunner's target was the British ship. The first shell tore over the Amethyst with a whine and exploded in the river. The crew was at action stations. A shell struck the wheelhouse, causing extensive damage and mortally wounding Commander Skinner and injuring his first lieutenant, Geoffrey Weston. The coxswain was also wounded, but he clung on to the ship's wheel. During the following few minutes, the Amethyst was repeatedly struck by PLA shells. One tore through the sick bay, and one the port engine room, reducing the ship's power. The injured coxswain grounded the Amethyst on Rose Island, the vessel coming to rest in a manner that prevented her 2 forward turrets from engaging the shore battery. PLA shells slammed into the stationary ship, killing and wounding dozens. Lieutenant Weston managed to send a frantic radio message to all nearby vessels. Under heavy fire. Am aground in approximate position 31 degrees 10 minutes north, 119 degrees 50 minutes east. Large number of casualties. A shell struck the radio room, knocking out the ship's communications temporarily, while another smashed the generator, disabling the vessel's electrics, including power to the gun turrets. The Amethyst was helpless and stuck fast. On the quarterdeck, the ship's doctor, Surgeon Lieutenant John Alderton, ran out to try and tend the many wounded, accompanied by sick berth attendant Owen Aubrey. A Chinese shell instantly killed both men. Although the 2 forward turrets could not be brought to bear on the enemy, the aft turret managed to fire 30 rounds before a Chinese shell hit home, disabling one of the 2 barrels. The other barrel fired off a few more shells, until the wounded Lieutenant Weston, who had assumed command from the dying Skinner, ordered it to cease fire in the hope that this would encourage the Chinese to do likewise. Weston now ordered as many of the crew as possible over the side. As shells continued to hammer the stricken Amethyst, everyone who could swim swam to Rose Island, all the time under a fearsome barrage of artillery shells and machine gun bullets. Several were killed. The walking wounded and non-swimmers managed to get away in the ship's only surviving boat. A total of 59 ratings and 4 Chinese mess boys made it alive to the nationalist-controlled South Bank. They were taken to a Nationalist Army field hospital for treatment before being trucked back to Shanghai. 40 unwounded sailors remained aboard, along with 12 wounded and 15 dead. Weston ordered the unwounded to arm themselves with Lee Enfield rifles and Bren light machine guns and to prepare to repel boarders. One member of the crew who was not evacuated was Simon, the ship's cat. In March 1948, when the Amethyst had been moored in Hong Kong, ordinary seaman George Hickenbottom had befriended the young stray that was hanging around the docks. The 17-year-old Hickenbottom had smuggled Simon aboard ship, and before long the crew, who appreciated Simon's ratting expeditions below decks, had adopted the friendly cat. Simon would leave dead rats as presents in sailors' bunks and had taken to sleeping in skipper Ian Griffith's inside his cabin. Simon was considered a lucky mascot, and when Bernard Skinner took over command in late 1948, he soon took a liking to the affable feline. The 21st of April 1949, Simon was in Skinner's cabin when it took a direct hit from a Chinese shell. As the evacuation of the crew was underway, a badly wounded Simon crawled out onto the deck, where sailors immediately took him to the sick bay for treatment. 4 pieces of shrapnel were removed from the cat, and it did not look as though the plucky animal would survive. By 11 a.m., the communist shelling had stopped, but any movement on the battered British ship attracted deadly accurate Chinese snipers. By now, a total of 22 British sailors had been killed and another 31 wounded. On the following day, Bernard Skinner, their mortally wounded skipper, also died. Aboard the Consort, quietly anchored in Nanking, the morning routine was about to be rudely shattered. I noticed Hutch, the petty officer yeoman of signals, approaching the captain with his signal board in his hand, recalled Petty Officer Curry. He saluted the captain, who returned his salute, and then read his signal. The captain turned and hurriedly made for the gangway. We were told that HMS Amethyst had come under fire, she was aground, and had suffered casualties. In no time at all lines were let go and the ship swung around to head downstream at 30 knots, the fastest a British warship had ever travelled on the Yangtze at that time. In order to make her neutral status abundantly clear to the Chinese, special precautions were taken. We had 2 white sheets, flags of truce, flying from both yardarms, recalled Curry. On either side of the bridge, large canvas squares were lashed, upon which were painted Union flags. Our white ensign streamed rippling from our stern. The Consort intended to take the battered Amethyst in tow, and aboard the Amethyst towing cables were hastily prepared. Unfortunately, the entire plan was doomed to failure as the Consort immediately attracted considerable fire from the north bank. Curry, an able seaman Beta, was standing by the unmanned Y gun shield, the Consort having a reduced peacetime complement that meant that some guns were missing crews. Suddenly, we saw a line of splashes rip across the water just astern of us, followed by an inoffensive popping noise, wrote Curry. Beta gasped, "I'm scared, P.O.," and doing my best not to look scared, said, "That makes two of us." Beta was called forward, and Curry requested a Bren gun and ammunition, which was granted. By now, the 3 4.5-inch guns had opened up. Also, I could hear the twin Bofors thumping away. All hell had broken loose. The Consort steamed past the Amethyst, preparing to take her under tow. The river at this point was about 1/3 of a mile wide, ideal for a crossing, said Curry. I could see one of their sandbag gun positions, and when they fired 3 or 4 guns together, the blast from the guns lifted the dust in an arc in front of the position. Curry lay in the prone position on the deck and loaded his Bren gun. I put my sights on 300 yards and as taut squeezed off a short burst and saw my fall of shot hit the water just in front of the sandbags. I raised the sight to 350 yards and squeezed off another burst. I had no traces, no hits on the water, so I was either hitting the sandbags or at least worrying the Chinese gunner. The Consort turned about and made another pass, firing as she went, but was unable to stop and take the Amethyst in tow. Our 4.5-inch shells were exploding on the banks of the river. The shells from the gun batteries were screaming overhead or hitting the water, some exploding and scattering shrapnel across the surface, recalled Curry. I could see a gun battery fire, and instantaneously the shells either hit or roared overhead. The Consort took an almighty battering as she was fired on at virtually point-blank range on the river. I decided to go forward, and as I reached the starboard door at the break of the forecastle, I saw young able seaman Beta. He looked shocked and was plastered with what looked like mints. I asked if he was okay. He made a shaky gesture with his thumb. "I'm okay. It's from them in there." The horrific nature of the fighting soon revealed itself to Curry. I stepped over the dwarf bulkhead slotted into the bottom of the door, and I looked down. An electrician lay dead, his lower jaw shot away. The dirty water from a shattered fire main ran across Consort's slightly rolling deck and covered his face and body. A stoker lay dead. There was a hole in his side. His liver gleamed wetly on an ammunition box. On the port side lay a messmate, the P.O. telegraphist, disemboweled and one leg off, hit by 2 75mm shells. I made my way to the bridge. It was at this time that I think action had been broken off. Curry was among many veterans of this battle who later questioned the common sense of placing British warships in such a dangerous situation. While Consort was making a turn and was virtually a stop target in the river, the Chinese gunners, in military terms, boxed us. They put a hole in the barrel of A gun and killed an ordinary seaman. B gun received a hit, removing the gun trainer's seat and taking most of his backside with it. He died later. The Consort narrowly avoided the same fate as the Amethyst. The wheelhouse was hit, killing the chief petty officer coxswain, and Consort raced for the bank out of control. The captain steered her by using the twin screws, wrote Curry. The gun transmitting station was hit, killing the petty officer and a young able seaman. The radio office was also hit. Many 37mm solid anti-tank shells passed right through the ship, wounding many sailors. The Consort gave up and signalled the Amethyst that she was heading for Shanghai. The destroyer had taken 56 hits from shells, with 10 crew killed and 30 wounded. The Amethyst remained stuck fast. Any movement on the ship's superstructure attracted Chinese sniper fire, but the Communists had at least stopped shelling the vessel. It seemed clear that the Chinese did not wish to sink the British warship. They could have pounded her to pieces with impunity had they wanted to. Instead, the Amethyst was being held hostage. But the Chinese had underestimated both Lieutenant Weston's resourcefulness and the determination of the Admiralty to rescue the Amethyst. For several days, Weston had tried to free the Amethyst from the sandbank until, on the night of the 22nd, he finally succeeded, after pumping 20 tons of oil fuel aft to lighten the vessel. Earlier in the afternoon, Weston had received a heartening signal from China Station headquarters. His Majesty's ships London and Black Swan are moving upriver to escort the Amethyst downstream. Be ready to move. The Consort, instead of heading directly for Shanghai, had instead rendezvoused with HMS London, a 9,750-ton County-class heavy cruiser dating from 1927. During the war, London had been part of the task force that had hunted and destroyed the German battleship Bismarck, as well as undertaking the hazardous task of escorting convoys to Murmansk in northern Russia. Armed with 8-inch guns, capable of delivering a 256-pound high-explosive shell up to 15 miles away, she was the most formidable vessel on the Yangtze in 1949. The Black Swan was Amethyst's sister ship, built in 1939. She had been the first British ship into Shanghai in September 1945, in company with the cruiser HMS Belfast, following the Japanese surrender. When the captain of the Consort heard that the London and Black Swan were going to try and reach the Amethyst, he volunteered his battered vessel. As we were so badly damaged in areas vital to our fighting ability, he was ordered to return to Shanghai by the commanding officer of London, wrote Petty Officer Curry. This we did, and on arrival, ambulances were waiting on the jetty to take our wounded to hospital. We carried our dead shipmates ashore on stretchers. They had been sewn up in canvas, and each body was wrapped in a white ensign. As we carried our dead, a group of American sailors, who had collected on the jetty, formed a sort of impromptu mourning party by dividing into 2 ragged ranks and then saluting as we filed past them to awaiting trucks. This gesture was more respectful than the headline in Time magazine a few weeks later. "Limeys knocked out of Chinese River," it said. "Who needed enemies when you had friends like these?" said Curry. Tune in next time to see if the Royal Navy can save HMS Amethyst, stuck in the Yangtze River. You have been listening to The Yangtze Incident, Britain's Last Battle in China, researched, written and narrated by Mark Felton. For short history documentaries on a wide variety of military subjects, please visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.